My Colonel's stepdad slapped me so hard in the middle of the Memorial Day parade that I tasted blood before I heard the crowd go silent. 1 second, the band was playing and kids were waving flags, and the next, there was just this dry crack that sliced through the music and into my skull. My head snapped to the side, my cover tilted, and for a heartbeat, I stared at the asphalt and the white line down the parade route, thinking, of course he did it here. I straightened, slowly tasting metal, and looked up into the furious red face of Colonel Mark Ellison, my stepfather, the man the whole base called Sir. "You embarrassed me in front of my soldiers, you ungrateful brat," he hissed. "You do not stand apart from your family, like you are somebody important. You do not deserve that uniform." His fingers clamped around my upper arm as he yanked me away from the row of distinguished guests toward the regular family seating, like he was dragging a disobedient teenager and not a commissioned officer. I felt eyes on us from every direction. For a moment, the old instinct flared up in me, the one that said, "Stay small, stay quiet, keep the peace." Then I saw the flash of a military police armband, saw my mother Linda staring at her folded hands, and saw my little brother Ethan frozen in his chair. Something in me clicked into place. I pulled my arm out of Mark's grip, not fast, not dramatic, just enough to force him to let go, and I heard myself say in a voice that carried farther than I meant, "You just hit an officer, sir. In public. On federal property." The words hung in the air. A few heads turned sharper at Officer. A young private near the rope line stared at my chest, not at the smear of red at the corner of my mouth, but at the small red and silver badge clipped above my name tape. Mark either did not hear or did not care. All he saw was the girl he had spent years cutting down to size, daring to talk back. "Do not you dare pull rank on me," he snapped. "You are nothing without this family. Nothing." I lifted my chin and met his eyes, and for the first time in my life, I was not looking up at him from the bottom of the food chain. Before I could answer, a shadow fell over us. "Mom," someone said quietly behind me, and I felt the shift in the crowd when a senior officer steps in. "Lieutenant Cole, report." I turned and found myself face to face with Major General Samuel Carter, Division Commander 2 Silver Stars, catching the afternoon light. His aide stood just behind him, eyes moving between my cheek and Mark's rigid shoulders. Sir Mark began, "This is a family matter. I will handle it." Carter did not glance at him. His gaze went straight to my name tape, then to the badge on my chest. For a heartbeat, his face went blank. Then the color drained from his cheeks. "Lieutenant Rylan Cole," he said slowly. "Understood." The band in the distance tried to pick up a melody again but faltered. The flag still waved, but nobody was watching them. They were watching us. Colonel Ellison Carter said, "Step away from Lieutenant Cole. Now, you are making a scene in front of civilians and your chain of command." For the first time since his hand had connected with my face, Mark seemed unsure. "Sir, with respect," he started. "I will correct her after the ceremony." Carter cut him off with a look that could have frozen concrete. "This is not about your home colonel. This is about what you just did to one of my officers in the middle of a Memorial Day event. Military police escort Colonel Ellison off the parade route. Now." 2 MPs stepped forward, one on each side of Mark. He stared at them, then at me, like the ground had shifted under his boots. Linda finally looked up, her face pale. Ethan sank lower in his chair. "This is ridiculous," Mark snapped. "You are really taking her side over mine." Carter's jaw tightened. His eyes flicked once more to the badge on my chest, then back to Mark's face. "You have no idea whose side you just hit," he said quietly. "Do not make it worse for yourself." The MPs closed in that last half step, and finally Mark moved. As they walked him away from the parade route, I stayed where I was, in the middle of the asphalt, the afternoon sun hot on my face, the taste of copper fading on my tongue. My fingers found the edge of my ID badge, tracing the numbers and letters no one in my family had ever bothered to ask about. He thought I was still the powerless kid he used to shout down in the kitchen. I thought, watching the back of his uniform jacket grow smaller. He had no idea who I had become once I finally got out of that house. 2 hours after the slap, I was sitting in a small interview room inside the administrative wing of Joint Base, Lewis McChord, the walls a dull off-white. The air conditioner humming loud enough to make my thoughts feel strangely distant, and I kept touching the corner of my mouth, where the dried line of blood still tugged at my skin every time I moved, a reminder of the moment my stepfather lost control in front of an entire parade, and a reminder that something in me had shifted the instant my cheek snapped to the side. The room held 3 people with authority to reshape everything that came next: a JAG major with a stack of folders, a CID agent who watched me with the steady attention of someone trained to pick apart truth from trauma, and Major General Carter, who stood near the door with his hands clasped behind his back as if holding back the storm of consequences that had already begun to spin around us. The JAG major spoke first, his tone neutral, but firm in the way legal officers are trained to sound. Lieutenant Cole. "Do you want to file a formal complaint against Colonel Ellison?" And I let my gaze fall to the table, where a faint reflection of my bruised cheek stared back up at me. And for a second, the memory of the parade hit me again, the sound of the crack, the silence that followed the little boy who had cried out when the music stopped. Mark's fingers digging into my arm like he had a right to drag me anywhere he pleased. I lifted my eyes slowly, not answering yet, and the CID agent shifted a page toward him, as if preparing to write down my choice, whatever it would be. Before I could speak, General Carter stepped forward, his voice quieter than I expected, but carrying a weight that made both JAG and CID look up. "Lieutenant Cole here is not just any officer. She is the youngest intelligence officer in this division to receive the Distinguished Service Cross," and the words landed in the room the way a dropped pin lands in a cathedral where everyone has been waiting for a revelation. The JAG major blinked at me with new recognition, and the CID agent straightened his questions, forming in a different direction now that he understood I was not simply a junior officer with a family dispute. I kept my hands folded, letting the truth settle without offering any explanation, because the mission that award came from was sealed behind more layers of clearance than anyone in this room except Carter could access, and because part of the reason that mission succeeded was the silence I had learned to master, growing up in a house where speaking up only made things worse. "He's been hitting something for as long as I can remember," I said, finally, my voice steady, though the old scenes rose up in flashes behind my eyes: walls when he was frustrated, tables when dinner was late, my mother when she disagreed with him, sometimes me when he needed someone smaller to absorb the blow, and today just happened to be the first time he did it where someone could stop him. The CID agent paused, his pen held slightly above the page, and the JAG major exhaled slowly, as if trying to measure the years of escalation behind the single bruise they could see. The major flipped open a folder and turned it around, revealing a printed sheet with highlighted lines, and he said something that made the room feel colder. There was an anonymous concern filed about Colonel Ellison a few years ago regarding temper issues. Nothing came of it. No evidence, no follow-up, but it is on the record. I stared at the paper, at the faint notes someone had once written behind closed doors, and a strange sensation swept through me, the realization that someone else had been afraid of him too, someone who had tried to speak but had not been able to finish the sentence, and I felt the sharp divide between my past and my present widen in a way that made breathing both easier and heavier. Carter moved closer to the table, then folding his arms, his gaze fixed on me rather than the bruise or the badge on my chest. "Whether you file or not," he said, "this incident is on record. It is no longer just a family matter, but it matters more if the person he hit is willing to speak." And the weight of the decision pressed against me, not as fear, but as the understanding that stepping forward meant shifting the balance that had kept me silent for so long. I looked at my hands, at the faint tremor in my left thumb, a habit I developed as a kid, trying to calm myself after Mark slammed doors or kicked chairs, and I knew the path I took out of that house had built me into someone far more difficult to break than he had ever expected. I did not answer yet, not because I was unsure, but because the moment deserved more than an impulsive yes or no, and I wanted the choice to come from strength rather than reaction. The room stayed quiet as they waited, and for the first time I understood that whatever I decided next would not only define what happened to Colonel Ellison, it would decide whether the girl who once hid in her room to avoid his footsteps still had any hold over the woman, sitting in uniform now bruised but unbowed, and ready to end something that should have ended years ago. I sat in that interview room with the taste of old memories rising in my throat, and as the silence stretched between me and the officers waiting for my answer, my mind drifted back to the first house my mother moved us into after she married Mark, a small beige two-story place on a quiet street in suburban Tacoma, where the lawns were trimmed neatly and neighbors waved from driveways and everything looked safe from the outside, while inside our kitchen, the first cracks in my childhood began to show long before anyone else cared to notice. I was 11 the first time Mark decided to teach me what he called discipline, when I dropped a glass of milk on the counter and it shattered on the floor louder than I expected, and he came storming in from the living room where football played on the television and slammed his hand so hard on the table that the salt shaker rattled toward the edge as he shouted in my face. In my unit, they would wash you out in the first week, and even though he did not raise a hand that day, the words hit like a slap, and I felt myself shrink inside my own skin, while my mother, Linda, stood near the stove with her lips pressed together, pretending to stir a pot of dinner she had forgotten was simmering. For a while, he only used his voice and the weight of his rank to crush me, painting every mistake, however small, as a failure of character, every question as disrespect, every emotion as proof that I was not built for anything worthwhile. But by the time I turned 13, the shouting turned into something else, something that made me move more quietly through the house, because one evening when I muttered a frustrated answer under my breath, he spun me around, gripping my shoulder so tightly his fingers left dark marks, and shoved me back against the hallway wall, hard enough that picture frames tilted and my breath caught halfway in my chest. My mother cried later that night, not in front of him, but in the laundry room behind closed doors, whispering, "He did not mean it. He is under a lot of stress. Deployment is coming. And you know how anxious he gets." And even though she tried to wipe her tears before stepping out, she never once asked if my shoulder hurt, or if I was scared. She only begged me not to make him lose face. The years between 12 and 16 blurred into a cycle of walking on eggshells, keeping my room spotless, avoiding the kitchen when he came home from work, because I knew that a plate not dried correctly, or a question he disliked, could set him off, and sometimes he slammed doors so hard the frames cracked. Sometimes he kicked the leg of a chair until it splintered, and sometimes his anger searched for a target small enough and quiet enough to absorb it without consequences. One night, when I was 14, the crash of something heavy breaking echoed through the house, and our neighbor, Mrs. Jacobs, must have heard it, because 10 minutes later, police lights flashed blue and red against our living room curtains, and 2 officers stepped inside asking if everyone was all right, and Mark appeared from the hallway in full uniform as if he had been preparing for inspection rather than exploding at us moments earlier, and he spoke calmly to them, saying, "Just a PTSD episode, officer, we are working with base counseling." And the officers softened immediately, nodding in understanding and turning to me only long enough to say, "If you are really in danger, talk to your school counselor," before leaving with a sympathetic pat on Mark's shoulder. That was the night I learned the truth about rank in a household like ours, that Mark's position in the military did not protect me or my mother or even the walls. He punched it, only protected him. That every time he put on that uniform, the world saw him as someone trustworthy, someone disciplined, someone burdened by service and sacrifice, while I saw the man who walked through the front door and kicked off his boots so hard they thudded against the wall, while Linda scrambled to hand him a beer before he found something else to criticize. I began to shrink myself to survive. I kept my voice soft and my footsteps lighter. I made myself small at the dinner table, ate quickly, cleaned quietly, hid in my room with a book. Even when the words blurred together from exhaustion, I learned to read the tension in his shoulders from the way he set down his keys to the tone he used when he said my name. And I learned that silence was safer than honesty, that letting him win an argument might spare me from being shoved into another wall. But somewhere in the spaces between his anger and my mother's apologies, I also learned something else, something that would one day become the backbone of every decision I made in uniform. That silence was not surrender. Silence could be a place where strength sharpened itself quietly, waiting for the moment it would matter, the moment when someone like him would overstep one time too many and find that the person he thought he could break had grown into someone he could no longer touch. The interview room faded from my mind as I remembered the day I finally left that suburban Tacoma house, the walls still carrying faint dents from years of Mark's temper, and how the morning light looked almost unreal as it spilled across my packed duffel bag because I had spent so long dreaming of escape that the reality of stepping out felt both too quiet and too loud at the same time. I was 18 then, and graduation week smelled like rain and fresh pavement. And while my classmates took pictures with their families, I stood in the kitchen listening to Mark say in the same clipped tone he used on soldiers who disappointed him that he would not spend a single cent on a college fund for someone who was not his blood if I wanted a degree or a uniform than I was on my own. And I remember nodding even though the words stung, because his disapproval had become so routine it felt almost predictable. What he did not know was that I had already submitted my ROTC applications months earlier, that a counselor at school had quietly guided me through the process after noticing how often I stayed late to avoid going home, that the University of Washington had sent an email offering a full ride through the program, and that the thought of him hearing the news filled me with more relief than pride, since it meant I could leave without asking him for anything. I packed my things the night before I moved to Seattle. Linda, hovering in the hallway, wiping her hands on a dish towel like she wanted to say something, but chose silence instead. And when dawn came, I walked out without looking back, because looking back might have made me stay just long enough for him to find another reason to keep me small. Seattle felt like an entirely different world, the campus alive with energy and possibility, and in ROTC I discovered a version of myself that had been waiting beneath years of fear, a young woman who was quick to learn steady, under pressure, and unexpectedly calm during field exercises that left others shaking with adrenaline, and my instructors took notice of how I never panicked, how I listened more than I spoke, how I solved problems by anticipating the next 10 steps. During officer training, I pushed harder than I ever had, running before sunrise, studying late into the night, refusing to be anything less than excellent, not because I wanted to prove something to Mark, but because I needed to prove to myself that I was more than the girl who once hid behind a bedroom door, counting the seconds until the storm downstairs passed, and by the time I commissioned as a second lieutenant, I ranked at the top of my cohort. My first assignment took me farther from home than I had ever imagined, a deployment supporting an intelligence team in a region where communication networks were unstable and threats shifted by the hour. And one night, while reviewing intercepted radio chatter, I recognized a pattern in the fragments of code that suggested a coordinated ambush on a special forces team operating nearby. And even though the data was incomplete, I trusted the logic that had kept me alive, growing up the instinct to read danger before it broke through the door. The analysis triggered a rapid response, and the team was redirected just minutes before the route they had planned to use was compromised. And when word came back that they had avoided a deadly trap because of a signal analysis made by a 21-year-old lieutenant with a quiet voice and a sharp mind, I felt a weight I did not realize I carried slide off my shoulders, proof that my existence mattered beyond the boundaries of a house where I once felt invisible. Months later, when I stood in dress uniform receiving the Distinguished Service Cross from a senior commander whose handshake felt like the passing of a torch I did not fully understand, yet a camera crew from the Department of Defense recorded a short feature about the intelligence work behind the rescue, my face appearing briefly on Pentagon Channel accompanied by a narrator describing a remarkable young officer whose clarity under pressure had saved American lives, and soldiers I had never met sent messages saying they hoped to serve with me one day. The video reached bases across the country, and even though I never sought attention, messages began circulating online calling me a quiet legend, a title that made me smile because it came from people who only knew the part of me that had grown in uniform, not the girl who once made herself small to survive. Meanwhile, back in Tacoma, the family group chat stayed silent except for one text from Linda, saying she had watched the beginning of the video before dinner burned and she would try again later. Though she never mentioned it again, and Mark scoffed when someone from his unit asked if he was proud, saying it was simply my job, nothing heroic, nothing special. In his eyes, I was still the stubborn stepdaughter who talked back, not the officer who had carried classified responsibility at an age when most people were still figuring out who they wanted to be. And the distance between how the military saw me and how my own family dismissed me widened until it felt like a canyon I had no reason to cross. By the time I completed another assignment and returned stateside in late 2022, my name had traveled farther than I expected, whispered among analysts and operators as someone who stayed calm under fire, someone who did not need recognition to do extraordinary work, someone whose silence carried strength rather than fear. And the irony was not lost on me that the very trait Mark punished had become the quality that earned me trust across units. Yet every visit home was a reminder that to them, I was still the girl who should have tried harder to please him. Still the one blamed for setting him off, still the one expected to shrink when he raised his voice. And they never realized that the woman walking into their kitchen with medals tucked beneath her coat was not the child they once cornered anymore. She was someone who had learned to turn quiet endurance into quiet power, someone who had built a reputation stronger than his anger, someone they could no longer diminish even if they pretended nothing had changed. When my deployment ended and orders came down assigning me to a Joint Task Intelligence cell at Joint Base Lewis McChord in early 2023, it felt on paper like a professional victory, the kind of posting where you work close to flag officers and handle information that shapes operations far beyond one installation. But when I saw the location printed at the top of the page, my stomach tightened because it meant returning to the same patch of Washington that I had once been desperate to escape, a place where my past and present would collide every time I left the secure facility and drove past the exit to the quiet street where my mother still lived with the man who never believed I would amount to anything. By day at the cell, I wore my uniform and my clearance like armor, sitting in rooms where colonels and generals asked for my assessment on signals and patterns that kept our people safe. And no one in those meetings looked at me like I was small or in the way they saw me as an asset, someone whose calm voice could cut through chaos. And it was almost easy to pretend the girl who used to flinch when a cupboard door slammed had been left behind in another life. Until the evening, my mother called and said Mark wanted to host a dinner for some of his colleagues, and since I was back at Lewis McChord, it would be polite to attend her voice, already sliding into the apologetic tone she used whenever she asked me to walk voluntarily into the same house where he once pushed me into walls. I told myself I could handle a few hours, that I was not a teenager anymore, that I had faced down far worse situations in uniform, but still my chest felt tight as I parked in front of the familiar beige house and walked up the path with a bottle of wine tucked under my arm like a peace offering, the scent of roast meat drifting through the open window and the sound of male laughter spilling out into the cool evening air. Inside the dining room, the table was set with the good plates we had only used on holidays when I was growing up. And 3 officers already sat with markmen around his age in pressed shirts, their jackets slung neatly over the backs of chairs. And when my mother introduced me as his daughter, he did not correct her with the word step, but his lips thinned just enough to signal that he was tolerating the label for the sake of appearance. "This is the one I told you about," he said to them with a dry chuckle. The stubborn kid, who thought she knew everything from the time she could walk, joined the army hoping someone would straighten her out, and his friends smiled politely. looking me over as if assessing whether I fit his description, and my jaw wanted to clench, but I kept my face neutral because I had long since learned that he loved nothing more than provoking a visible reaction. My uniform hung freshly pressed in my closet on base that night, while I stood in jeans and a simple sweater sleeves pushed to my elbows as my mother nudged me toward the kitchen, asking me to help with dishes and serving. And though I could have reminded her that I had spent the day writing briefs for commanders, she was clearly nervous, and I did not want to make her choose a side in her own house, so I moved through the familiar rituals of carrying plates to the table and refilling glasses, listening as the men traded deployment stories and complaints about policy, their words blending into the background hum of a world I knew intimately, yet was being kept at the margins of in that room. At one point, the conversation turned to a recent training mishap overseas, and one of the officers misquoted a detail about the intelligence picture. And before I could stop myself, I spoke up from the doorway, gently correcting the location and explaining that the reporting from that area had been compromised for weeks due to a sensor issue information I knew, because I had worked on the reroute plan, and for a brief instant the officer nearest me looked interested, nodding as if he might ask how I knew. But Mark cut across the moment with the effortless authority of a senior field grade telling a private to stand down. When I want to hear from a junior officer, I will ask, he said with a laugh that invited the others to share in the joke. Until then, you clear dishes and let the adults talk, and a flicker of heat rose under my skin. Not because he called me junior, which I was by rank compared to them, but because he had neatly rolled me back into the role of household help in front of the very men who would normally treat me as a colleague if we were anywhere else. I reached for a plate without arguing, feeling the old instinct to shrink trying to tug me downward when one of the guests, a lean man with graying hair at his temples and lieutenant colonel rank on the coat, folded over his chair, glanced more closely at the small coin and subdued patch attached to the side of my bag resting against the wall, items I had kept with me out of habit after leaving the office, and his expression shifted almost imperceptibly, the casual dinner smile slipping into something sharper recognition, flickering across his face like a light turning on. You are Cole, right? He asked later when I returned to pour more water, his tone lower than before, and when I nodded, he studied me with a new respect in his eyes. I saw a video a while back about an intel officer who helped redirect a special forces team out of a bad situation. Name stuck with me. He said, his voice careful. And while Mark was turned toward the kitchen, bragging about how hard he rode his staff, the lieutenant colonel gave me a look that said, plainly he did not buy the helpless picture my stepfather had just painted. He did not challenge Mark at the table, did not embarrass him in front of his guests, but I watched him watching the dynamic, storing details the way people in our world do when something feels off. And when dessert was done and my mother insisted on packing leftovers for everyone, I heard him murmur a polite thank you at the door, before his eyes met mine once more with a silent message that he understood there was more to this house than a home-cooked meal and a proud colonel host. I did not know until later that his name was Lieutenant Colonel Hayes and that he had gone back to base after that dinner and written a concise email to Major General Carter, the subject line, carrying no emotion, but the body loaded with implication. Sir, are you aware that Colonel Ellison's stepdaughter, the young intel officer he keeps mocking in front of company, is the same Lieutenant Cole who received the Distinguished Service Cross for that classified rescue? A simple question that would become another small weight, tipping the balance on a scale that had been uneven for far too long. The week before Memorial Day settled over JBLM with that strange mix of ceremony-focused pride and quiet tension that always comes before big public events, and while my days inside the Joint Intelligence Office were filled with routine briefings and quiet analytical work, my nights were a different battleground entirely because every time I drove off base toward my mother's house, the weight of what was coming pressed against my ribs like a hand daring me to flinch. Mark called a family meeting the Sunday before the parade, his voice sharp as the snapping of a salute, as he ordered Linda and Ethan into the living room. and when I walked in, he did not offer a greeting. He simply straightened to his full height and said, "We need to get something straight before next weekend," his eyes moving from me to them as if he were addressing soldiers instead of a wife and 2 children who had spent years tiptoeing around his temper. He told them they would stand with him at the parade and that if I said anything disrespectful or behaved in any way that reflected badly on him, they were to take his side, immediately insisting that unity made families strong, even though he was the one who fractured ours every time his voice rose. And I watched my mother nod with that worn-out, fear-shaped agreement she had mastered over the years, while Ethan fidgeted in the doorway, not fully understanding, but sensing the pressure, like a storm front. Then he turned to me, his lips curling as he delivered the line he must have rehearsed in his head. "At the parade you show up as part of my family, and nothing more. Do not expect any special status in the military, because you have not earned anything that gives you priority over actual officers," a sentence so deliberately humiliating. I almost laughed because the only reason it stung was the knowledge that he still saw me as the girl he used to shove aside in cramped hallways, not the woman whose signature had redirected missions. I said nothing, not because his words carried authority, but because silence served me better. Now silence let him think he had control, while I examined the shape of his fury and recognized something new beneath it, a desperation that told me he felt his grip slipping. I left their house that night with my mother's, texts still chiming through messages, telling me to please not provoke him, to remember he had been under stress lately, to avoid any tone he might interpret as disobedience in reading them. I felt a strange clarity settle over me. Not anger exactly, but the understanding that his power only existed where I allowed it to. The next morning I walked into JAG under the pretense of dropping off a document for the intelligence office, but instead of leaving, I lingered outside Major Williams' door until he noticed me and asked if something was wrong, and I stepped in quietly and closed the door behind me because the question forming in my mind needed a witness, not a friend. If a senior officer assaults a junior officer on base during a formal ceremony while the junior officer is in uniform, what happens? I asked, keeping my tone level and professional, and he leaned back, slowly studying my face with the kind of careful attention attorneys reserve for statements that sound hypothetical but are anything but. If it is documented and reported, he said, it ends careers. No hesitation, no caveat, just a simple truth that settled into my bones, like the final piece of a plan I had not wanted to build but could no longer ignore. I nodded, as if the answer had been academic, and thanked him before leaving the office. But once I stepped into the hallway, my pulse thudded with a cold, steady rhythm that felt like a countdown, because I finally understood that the parade would not be the explosive outburst Mark imagined. It would be the moment he stepped directly into the consequences he had spent years outrunning. Over the next several days, I began documenting everything with the slow, deliberate precision of someone cleaning a rifle before a qualifying test, noting down each outburst he directed at me, or at my mother, writing the exact time and location of his remarks, capturing the tone he used when he warned Ethan not to embarrass him in front of other officers. And I saved every text my mother sent telling me to stay quiet for the sake of peace. Texts that revealed more about the environment we lived in than any lengthy report ever could. I did not provoke him, and I did not escalate. I simply stepped back and let him reveal himself the way he always did when he felt control threatened. And each night, as I typed out my notes at my small desk on base, the shape of the trap grew sharper in my mind, not a malicious trap, but a lawful one constructed from truth and timing, and the knowledge that he would choose violence long before he chose accountability. I kept my uniform ready, my ID, my badge tucked exactly where it would be visible if anyone bothered to look, and with each passing day, a quiet certainty built inside me, because for the first time, the battlefield was not his kitchen or his hallway or the back seat of a car filled with silence. It was a federal installation on a ceremonial day with cameras everywhere and witnesses who did not owe him loyalty, and all I had to do was stand still and let him act exactly as he always had, while the world finally watched. By the time the Friday before the parade arrived, the air around JBLM felt charged. Soldiers rehearsed their formations, families planned their routes to the best viewing spots, and somewhere beneath the hum of preparation, I could almost hear the quiet click of gears aligning inside a machine, long overdue for activation, a machine that would not protect him the way his rank had shielded him in civilian neighborhoods. And that is when it truly settled in the realization that the slap everyone would talk about later was never a spontaneous spark of anger. It was the final, predictable miscalculation of a man who had built an entire identity on being untouchable, stepping with full force into a wall I had stopped holding up for him. Memorial Day morning unfolded with a brightness that felt almost unreal. The kind of sharp, clear light that made the flags lining the avenue shimmer like they were breathing. And as I walked toward the designated area near the reviewing stand, the familiar cadence of drums rolled through the air, while children waved miniature flags and veterans in wheelchairs nodded with quiet pride. The scene so perfect it almost hid the tension simmering beneath everything I carried inside. I stood where the base protocol officer had directed me, a reserved section for personnel with certain assignments and clearances. The red and silver tag clipped to my pocket, catching the sun as I adjusted my posture. And for a moment, I let myself believe it would simply be a day of observation, a day where I did not have to brace for anything except the sound of marching boots. Then I heard his voice cutting through the hum of the crowd like a blade, scraping metal. And when I turned, I saw Mark pushing past families and volunteers, his face red, not from heat, but from the fury that always rose whenever something did not align with the script in his head. And even before he reached me, I recognized the dangerous tightness around his mouth that used to precede slammed doors and shattered plates. He stopped just short of me, but his voice carried far enough for heads to turn as he demanded to know who had allowed me into this section, saying I had no business standing among officers assigned to the command element, accusing me of sneaking into a place where I did not belong. And although a protocol sergeant tried to intervene, Mark waved him off with a dismissive gesture that made 3 people nearby flinch. You are not family enough to stand with us and not important enough to stand with them. He hissed, stepping closer until the faint scent of his aftershave mixed with the smell of hot pavement. And when he noticed the badge on my chest, his expression twisted. You think one little medal makes you my equal? Do you really believe anyone here sees you as anything but a mistake that somehow made it into uniform? Conversations died around us as people sensed the shift in the air, the kind of sudden silence that falls when something inappropriate begins to crack into public view. And before I could respond, he reached out and grabbed the front of my jacket with the same careless aggression he used to show when dragging me out of the way as a kid, yanking hard enough to pull me slightly off balance. Phones lifted without hesitation, some out of instinct to record a disturbance, some because uniforms in conflict draw attention, even among crowds used to ceremony, and the lenses caught everything from the way his hand tightened to the moment he slapped me with a force that snapped my head to the side, the sound sharp enough to make a child nearby cry, and sharp enough to make a military police officer halfway down the route start moving toward us. For a heartbeat, I tasted copper and dust and the faint sweetness of the lemonade someone had spilled earlier on the curb, and in that sliver of suspended time, I saw faces freeze, saw a woman cover her mouth, saw a young private lower his phone, slightly in disbelief, before lifting it again to keep recording, and something inside me stilled in a way that felt almost peaceful, because the moment I had feared and anticipated and prepared for was finally unfolding, exactly as I had known it would. Mark kept shouting his words, spilling out in bursts, as if humiliation burned too hot for him to contain, accusing me of trying to upstage him, of embarrassing his name in front of people who mattered, of pretending to be more than the ungrateful burden he had spent years claiming I was, and he was so consumed by the need to dominate the moment that he failed to notice the cluster of phones all pointed in our direction. He failed to see the junior officer whispering urgently into a radio. He failed to recognize that the parade route was covered by dozens of base cameras, quietly feeding footage to security rooms across the installation. Somewhere behind him, a young soldier in dress blues muttered "holy hell" under his breath as he typed furiously into his phone, sending the clip to a group chat that would within minutes spread the video across units faster than a formal report ever could. And while Mark continued to rant, he did not realize that each word, each gesture, each attempt to assert control was being preserved in crystal clarity. When he finally noticed the military police closing in his face, shifted from anger to confusion to something like dawning panic, a realization flickering across his features that this was no longer the private domain of his household where fear kept people silent. This was public. This was federal property. This was a ceremony watched by officers and civilians alike, and his title could not shield him from the truth captured on a dozen screens. The MP approached with measured steps and called his rank, requesting he step back, but he ignored the command too, wrapped in his fury to understand that every second he refused made the situation worse. And when the officer moved closer, people in the crowd murmured a ripple of shock spreading as they recognized the severity of what had happened. I did not speak until he jabbed a finger toward my chest again and said, "You have always been a problem, and today proves it," and only then did I straighten fully, meeting his eyes with the calm that had carried me through deployment after deployment, telling him in a steady voice, "You just assaulted an officer on base during a federal ceremony, and there are cameras everywhere." The shift in the crowd was immediate, a collective intake of breath as the context snapped into place, and even though General Carter had not yet reached us, I could already feel the balance of power tilting, not because I had raised my voice or fought back, but because every witness present had seen for themselves what he truly was. By the time Carter appeared at the edge of the formation, his eyes going sharply to the red mark still burning on my cheek, the video had already reached several soldiers farther down the road, and the story was already changing from an argument between family members to a clear act of misconduct committed in the open. And in that moment, the game changed forever, shifting from his word against mine to something undeniable, something visible, something the entire base would soon be talking about. The week after the parade moved with the slow, heavy weight of something irreversible, every sunrise arriving, with the reminder that the slap which once lived only in the shadows of my childhood now existed on screens across JBLM, and by Monday morning the formal machinery of the military had already begun to turn, pulling me from the intelligence office and guiding me toward the JAG suite with the quiet efficiency of a system that had seen this kind of misconduct before. The hallway outside Major Williams' office smelled faintly of coffee and printer toner, the same sterile scent I had passed 100 times, yet stepping through the doorway felt different now, because for the first time I was not the silent child swallowing humiliation or the cautious lieutenant weighing the cost of speaking. I was someone ready to place every piece of truth on the table and let the law speak where fear once dictated silence. The conference room they brought me into held a long table, a stack of forms and 2 chairs facing the polished surface, and when the CID agent entered with a folder under his arm, he greeted me with a neutral professionalism that told me he was here for facts, not sympathy, something I appreciated more than he would ever know. "We will take your statement in full," he said. "You will have time to review before you sign, and once you have signed it, becomes part of the official record." And as he spoke, I felt a surprising steadiness rise inside me, the kind I used to search for late at night as a teenager when I tried to imagine what adulthood might feel like if I ever escaped the house where yelling had been more common than sleep. I began at the beginning my voice even as I described how Mark had treated me as a child, how his temper had always been something we navigated rather than confronted, how he used his status to smooth over the crack in a wall or the tears in my mother's eyes whenever a neighbor got concerned enough to call for help. And I spoke without embellishment, because the truth needed no decoration, it carried its own weight. The CID agent wrote steadily occasionally, asking for a timestamp or clarification. And when I reached the years where I left for college, he nodded, understanding how the pattern of abuse had simply shifted, rather than vanished, resurfacing whenever I returned home for holidays or brief visits that always ended with me retreating early back to campus under the excuse of exams. I handed over the small notebook where I had written his outbursts from the week before the parade, each line dated and noted with place and tone, and then I unlocked my phone and scrolled through the texts my mother had sent over the years, urging me to keep peace, to avoid setting him off, to remember he was under strain messages, written in the vocabulary of someone who had lived too long with fear and had mistaken survival strategies for family loyalty. There was even an old voicemail from a neighbor recorded years earlier, a woman in her 50s who had said she heard shouting again and wanted me to know she was there if I needed anything, a message I had saved without understanding how important it might one day become. When the agent excused himself to make copies, I sat quietly in the conference room, running my thumb along the edge of the table, feeling something lift from my chest. Not relief exactly, but a loosening, like exhaling after holding a breath for years. And when Major Williams walked in, he gave me a nod that carried a gravity I rarely saw in him. Once you sign this, it becomes real in the system. He said it is not just a family incident anymore, it becomes a duty matter. And his phrasing struck me deeply because it framed the entire situation not as a personal failing or private tragedy, but as misconduct committed within the sphere of the uniform he had always used as a shield. I signed slowly, my name steady across the page, and as the ink dried, I felt the shift, the transformation from silent target to someone asserting her place in the system that had long upheld standards Mark had repeatedly violated. Meanwhile, Mark launched his counterattack, arriving at CID with the false confidence of someone used to being believed, dismissing the entire parade incident as an overreaction, telling investigators that I had always been dramatic, that I misunderstood discipline for aggression, that the stress of deployment had clearly affected my judgment, and when he implied I might be unstable, the CID agent simply made a note and did not comment, which told me he had already encountered that tactic from others before. That afternoon, CID requested access to my merit file and my psych evaluations documents built over years of service. And when they arrived, the contrast between reality and Mark's narrative became impossible to ignore, because my evaluations reflected steadiness under pressure, resilience, clear cognitive function, and commendations for decision-making in high-stress environments, while tucked into Mark's personnel file was a 7-year-old note indicating that anger management counseling had been recommended after a climate survey flagged concerns in his command. It had never been completed. The CID agent returned, with both files setting them side by side on the table in a gesture that said more than any speech could. And as he walked me through the next steps, I felt the full shift in power, the tectonic movement that happens when truth and documentation align, when patterns are finally seen for what they are, when the facade someone relied on begins to crack under the weight of its own history. For the first time in my life, the official record tilted unmistakably in my direction, not because of emotion or sympathy, but because of evidence, because of the things I had endured quietly, because of the choices he had made carelessly. And as I left the JAG office that day, the air tasted different, sharper, cleaner, almost bright, and I knew that whatever came next would no longer be defined by the old equation of his authority against my silence. It would be defined by the one thing he could never manipulate: the truth, written in black and white. Over the next 2 months, the consequences did not fall all at once like a hammer. They arrived in small, precise cuts that shaved away at the authority Mark had wrapped around himself for decades, and watching it happen from a distance felt less like vengeance and more like the natural correction of a system he had assumed would always bend in his favor. It started with meetings, the kind of closed-door briefings he used to brag about at family dinners, saying he had a seat at every important table on base, that nothing moved without his input, and suddenly, those calendar invites slowed, then stopped, replaced quietly by notices that certain topics were restricted to personnel not under review. And though no one made a public announcement, everyone in his circle understood what pending investigation, limited access, meant, a phrase soft enough to sound temporary, but sharp enough to carve away his influence. I would pass him sometimes in the headquarters hallway, his step a little too quick, his eyes flicking to doors he was no longer welcome to walk through, and where he once strutted, he now moved like a man trying to outrun something he could not quite see, snapping at staffers when they could not conjure invitations that simply did not exist anymore. And in those moments, I felt a quiet satisfaction curl in my chest, not because I had engineered every detail, but because for the first time, the ripples of his behavior were reaching him instead of stopping at us. My own part in this phase of his unraveling was simple. I stopped insulating him from the truth when a wife at the officers' club caught me near the coffee urn and asked in a low, uncertain voice if it was true he had hit me in uniform at the parade. I met her eyes and said, "Yes, he did, in front of everyone, and you should be careful around him." And there was no malice in my voice, only honesty. But the way she tightened her grip on her glass and glanced across the room at her own husband told me the story would travel faster and cleaner than any formal memo. When the Inspector General team came through for a scheduled climate survey, they requested private conversations with officers and enlisted members, and instead of giving the vague protective answers I might have offered in the past, I described the environment around Mark with surgical clarity. I talked about how he dismissed subordinate concerns, how he used his rank as a shield, how his temper created more fear than respect, and I watched the IG representative jot down notes with that impassive look that said these were not the first allegations of this kind he had heard, nor would they be the last. Meanwhile, the base itself began to reflect his new status back at him in small, irritating ways that added up. When he tried to swipe into the gym one morning, the reader blinked red and denied access, forcing him to stand aside, while younger soldiers came and went until a clerk informed him he needed to update his privileges because of an ongoing review, and I heard from someone at the front desk that he had raised his voice about being disrespected before storming off to deal with paperwork he once would have considered beneath him. His reserved parking spot near headquarters, the one he had proudly pointed out to relatives on visits, was reassigned to another officer several weeks into the investigation, a quiet administrative change that meant he now parked in the general lot like everyone else walking past the sign bearing another name where his used to be. And though it was a small thing, it cut at the image he had of himself as someone permanently elevated above the mass of uniforms around him. Even off base, the widening circle of consequences followed. He applied for a volunteer position on a local school board, something he had long talked about as his next step after retirement, expecting his rank to open doors, but the application was put on hold, then declined, the polite letter, citing a pending investigation that made it impossible to consider him for a role working closely with families and children. And according to my mother, he had crumpled the notice up and thrown it across the room, muttering that people these days were too sensitive. Through all of this, I did not lift a finger in any way that violated regulations. I did not spread rumors. I did not embellish details. I simply refused to cover for him, refused to lie, refused to soften the edges of what he had done. And that alone created a pressure he had never experienced before, a pressure that came not from defiant teenagers or frightened spouses, but from peers and systems and institutions beginning to see what we had lived with for years. In his mind, though, none of this was connected to his own actions when word reached me through family that he had been grumbling at the officers' club about how the military had changed, how politics and what he called woke culture were ruining good careers over one little misunderstanding. I realized he truly did not grasp that the origin of his downfall was not some shift in external values, but his own choices, his own slap, his own history of intimidation finally catching up. He blamed shifting norms. He blamed younger soldiers who recorded everything. He blamed lawyers and inspectors and anyone else convenient, and the fact that he never once looked in the mirror and saw the real problem made the slow erosion of his authority feel less like a petty victory and more like a necessary unveiling. Each small inconvenience, each revoked privilege, each closed door peeling back the layers until he stood alone in the center of a life built on control that he no longer fully possessed. From my vantage point in the intelligence cell, I watched him become a cautionary tale in whispered conversations, the colonel under investigation, whose outburst at a parade had exposed deeper fractures in his leadership, and I continued my work steady and focused, knowing that the most powerful revenge I could enact was to keep doing my job well, while his world constricted around him, one quiet administrative decision at a time, until he finally understood that the era where hurting people came with no cost was over whether he chose to accept that or not. The administrative hearing convened on a gray morning that seemed to mirror the weight in the air, the sky low over Joint Base Lewis McChord, as if even the weather understood that something irreversible was about to unfold. And when I stepped into the corridor outside the conference room, the hush felt different from ordinary military quiet. It carried the charged anticipation of a place where reputations were about to be stripped bare. Inside, the long, polished table had been arranged with practiced formality. General Carter seated at the head with a JAG colonel to his right, 2 additional senior officers along the side, and a CID representative who had laid a thick folder in front of him. And when Mark entered, a few minutes later, he still wore the posture of a man accustomed to deference, his chin lifted slightly, as if he believed this would be little more than a misunderstanding to clear up. The meeting began with procedural language, the kind meant to frame everything as neutral, but the tone shifted sharply when the CID representative pressed play on the monitor mounted against the far wall, the first frame showing the parade route, the American flags waving the crowd alive with patriotic energy, and then the image of me standing in uniform, followed by the unmistakable crack of his hand across my face, the crowd freezing my body, jolting his voice, snarling in a way that no editing software could soften. Faces of civilians were blurred for privacy, yet the audio remained intact, every word he had thrown at me, echoing across the sterile conference room, and I watched the expressions around the table, tightened jaws, set eyes narrowing at the proof they could neither refute nor defend, and even Mark shifted in his chair, the scene clearly looking different when played back for men who valued discipline more than excuses. After the video ended, the JAG colonel read aloud the documented pattern of concerns that had followed Mark for years. Anonymous notes counseling recommendations, ignored climate surveys, flagging temper issues, and as each line was spoken, his face flushed a deeper shade, the confident tilt of his posture eroding as the history he had hidden under rank slowly surfaced. It was then they asked me to enter, and when I stepped through the doorway in full uniform ribbon rack, a lined and polished intelligence badge, catching the overhead light, the room shifted in a subtle yet unmistakable way, the kind of shift where authority was reassigned without a word. A lieutenant colonel, seated midway down the table, leaned toward the officer next to him and whispered an almost stunned question. "That is the Rylan Cole, the DSC intel officer, right?" And though he spoke softly, it carried enough that I felt the old ghost of invisibility dissolve, replaced by a presence I had earned through years of work no one at home had cared to understand. Mark did not turn to look at me, perhaps because he already sensed that something foundational had tilted, or perhaps because facing me as an officer instead of a stepdaughter forced him into a truth he had never prepared himself to confront. And as General Carter addressed me with professional respect, I saw a brief flicker of something like resentment cross Mark's face, as if the room was betraying him by granting me the recognition he believed belonged only to him. I answered questions without dramatization, recounting the events of the parade, the history of his anger, the moments I had downplayed for years. And as I spoke, I sensed, rather than saw, movement outside the door, the soft shuffle of someone too close to be a passerby, and when the JAG colonel called for a brief recess, I stepped into the hallway and found my 17-year-old brother, Ethan, standing frozen, eyes wide face, drained of the certainty he once had in the man he had idolized. He must have followed my mother to the hearing without fully understanding what it was, and now he had heard everything. The slap replayed the evidence listed, the general calling my stepfather's behavior a disgrace to the uniform, and when his gaze lifted to mine, there was confusion first, then hurt, then something heavier that made him seem older than he had an hour earlier. He whispered, almost choking on the words, "Is it all true? Did he really do all that?" And for a moment I saw the child version of him standing in the hallway of our old house clutching a toy. While our parents argued behind a closed door, the memory hitting me in a way I could not have prepared for, and I nodded slowly, because lying in that moment would have protected no one. My mother stood a few feet away, her face pale, her hands trembling with the effort of holding herself together, watching her son's illusions shatter in a way more brutal than any disciplinary hearing. And for the first time, I saw her realize that this was not simply a military matter. It was a fracture running straight through her family. When the hearing resumed, the tone had changed even further. Mark tried to speak in his own defense, saying things about misunderstandings, about stress, about misinterpretations, grasping for the authority that slipstreamed behind his rank for so long. Yet each justification landed flat against the weight of documented evidence, against the clarity of the video, against the knowledge that the officers in the room had already seen, who had lost composure and who had maintained it. The moment that sealed his fall came when General Carter leaned forward and spoke with the slow, heavy emphasis of someone delivering judgment, saying, "This behavior is a disgrace to the uniform and to the standards we uphold," and the room went silent in a way that felt final. By the time the session ended, Mark looked smaller. Somehow, the crisp lines of his uniform unable to hold the shrinking space around his authority. And as I stepped out into the hallway, Ethan refused to look at him, stepping aside without a word, a gesture that hit him harder than any reprimand read aloud. It was in that moment I saw the true cost of his choices, not only his career unraveling, but the collapse of the heroic image he had cultivated in the eyes of the one person who had believed in him without question, and the quiet devastation in that realization was a consequence. He had never anticipated the consequence that marked the beginning of the end. By late summer, the air in Tacoma carried that dry warmth that settles in after the last heat wave, the kind that makes the evenings feel quiet and honest, and I had just finished arranging the last few books in my new apartment when the knock came sharp and insistent in a way that told me it was not a neighbor dropping off a welcome note. When I opened the door, my mother stood there first, her eyes already red, her hands twisting a tissue, the way she used to when trying to pretend nothing was wrong, and behind her was Mark, no longer in uniform, wearing civilian clothes that somehow made him look smaller, as though losing the rigid lines of the military fabric had stripped away something he relied on more than he realized. He stepped forward and spoke before I invited them, in his voice low and oddly careful, asking if we could talk, and my mother gave me a pleading glance, so I stepped aside and let them enter, because part of me needed to see how far his audacity would stretch. Now that the walls he had built around himself were collapsing, the moment the door closed, he began not with an apology, not with accountability, but with a request disguised as concern, telling me that things had gotten out of control, that rumors were spreading that the investigation was harming his future far more than the incident merited, and he looked at me as if expecting sympathy, saying that if I would just clarify to the board that it had been a family misunderstanding exaggerated by the moment the whole ordeal could settle quietly. My mother backed him up with a trembling voice, saying that I was ruining his career, that I knew how much the retirement meant to him, that I should not let one mistake destroy everything he had worked for. And hearing her say "worked for" made something in my chest pull tight, because for years everyone had framed his anger as effort, his violence as stress, his manipulation as pressure, and I had spent half my life bending myself into smaller shapes to keep those narratives afloat. When he switched tactics and claimed regret, saying he should not have hit me there in public where people could misinterpret, I felt the familiar sting of the old dynamic, the way he framed harm as an inconvenience for himself. Not a wound for me, as if the error was the setting, not the act, and I let him speak without interrupting, watching him twist reasoning into knots so he could stand in my living room pretending to take responsibility while actually avoiding every truth that mattered. Then he stepped closer, lowering his voice again, saying, "I knew how stress worked, how deployments affected people, how much pressure rested on someone with his rank, and as he gestured vaguely toward the future, he believed he still deserved. He asked if I really wanted to see him lose everything over something that could remain private if I chose silence once more." The words washed over me in a strange wave, not painful the way they used to be, but clear, like the last pieces of an old puzzle snapping into place, revealing a picture I had been too close to fully see. And I realized he was not here out of remorse. He was here because he finally understood that I held something he never believed I could possess the power to refuse him. I let the silence stretch a little, letting him stand there, between hope and dread, until I finally said the sentence that made him straighten as if bracing for impact, telling him I did not leak anything about him, that his own actions did the leaking, that the system was responding to evidence, not emotion, and that the only thing I had done was stop lying for him. My mother gasped softly as if I had slapped someone, though no one had touched anyone, and I turned toward her as gently as I could, while still grounding my words, telling her that I had already passed her name to the victim advocate, that if she had lived under the weight of his anger, she could finally choose herself, speak up, claim support, or she could keep living the life she always had, but that choice was hers now, not his. The expression on her face shifted in slow, painful stages, disbelief becoming fear, fear becoming confusion, confusion becoming the terrible awareness of a woman realizing the door she refused to open for decades had been unlocked all along. And in that moment, I saw her struggle with loyalty habit and the tremors of awakening, and yet she said nothing, her silence folding around her like a shield she could not yet set down. Mark's reaction, however, was far less layered, his jaw tightening, his nostrils flaring slightly as he tried to swallow the anger that had once erupted without consequence. And though he said nothing outright, he gave me a look filled with the restrained fury of someone who had never experienced boundaries from me, before someone who could not comprehend that I did not owe him protection. When I opened the door again in a gesture that said the conversation was over, he walked out stiffly. His steps clipped each one, a small battle between his instincts to lash out and the awareness that any misstep would bury him deeper. And my mother followed slowly, pausing in the doorway to look back at me with a sadness that made her seem both older and strangely smaller. Caught between two worlds, she had never learned how to exit or defend. After the door closed, the apartment felt quiet in a way that was not hollow but clean, like the air had shifted and finally aligned with something long delayed. And as I stood there, I felt the unfamiliar pulse of relief settle in my chest, because I had met the audacity of his request not with fear, but with clarity, establishing a boundary that was not cruel, but necessary, a boundary that said the era of protecting him at my expense had ended. In that moment, I understood that this was not just revenge, it was reclamation, the kind that reshaped the story not only for myself, but for anyone he might have hurt in the shadows, and the justice of that truth stayed with me long after the echo of their footsteps faded down the hallway. By the time autumn settled in and the leaves around Joint Base Lewis McChord had begun turning the shade of burnt copper that signals the year's slow descent, the investigation that had shadowed every corridor conversation finally reached its end, and the notice of the board's findings arrived with the clinical weight of an official truth that could no longer be reshaped by excuses or rank. The conference room where the results were delivered was the same room where I had once sat trembling years earlier during a routine evaluation, yet walking into it now felt strangely steady, as if every step carried the quiet knowledge that what was coming had been earned not through revenge, but through the system finally catching up to the reality we had lived with for years. When General Carter read the conclusions aloud, the words landed with a clean finality conduct, unbecoming an officer assault of a junior officer pattern of domestic intimidation, each phrase sharp and unambiguous, removing the layers of respectability Mark had used as armor. And even though he was not present in the room, the weight of those findings seemed to fill the empty chair where he would have sat had he chosen to hear the verdict directly. The CID representative added the investigative summary outlining evidence that stretched far beyond the parade incident, referencing past counseling recommendations and repeated concerns about his temper. And for the first time in his career, the narrative surrounding him was shaped not by his authority, but by documented truth. Truth reviewed and affirmed by people who valued the integrity of the uniform above the comfort of an officer, too used to escaping consequence. When the board recommended forced retirement, the words did not ring vindictive. They rang inevitable, as if this outcome had been overdue. Long before the slap at the parade and the list of restrictions that followed painted an even clearer picture loss of certain privileges, removal from leadership eligibility. No future advisory roles, no participation in mentorship programs, a slow, intentional stripping of the influence he once wielded with unchecked ease. As the meeting concluded, the JAG colonel lingered, closing the file with a measured motion, before asking me quietly if we could speak off record, and when the room cleared, he leaned forward with an expression that carried both respect and caution, saying there is still the option to push for more if you want it. His tone neutral, yet acknowledging the gravity of what that question implied. For a moment, the room felt smaller, as if everything narrowed to a single point where choice and history intersected, and I thought of the years of shouting in the kitchen of the slammed doors, the bruised pride, the stolen childhood. Quiet, the parade slap still echoing in the memory of every soldier who had watched it unfold, and I realized with surprising calm that the desire for punishment had long ago burned out, replaced instead by a deeper desire for prevention, for safety, for a world where he could no longer hide behind the cloth he had misused. I told the JAG colonel I don't need him in prison. I just need him unable to hurt anyone under the excuse of the uniform ever again. And as the words left my mouth, they felt less like mercy and more like clarity, the kind of clarity that forms only when pain has been navigated rather than ignored. The JAG nodded slowly, as if he understood that revenge was not always measured in bars and sentencing. Sometimes it was measured in the quiet erasure of power, the way influence collapses when stripped of titles, the way truth removes the stage on which someone once stood unchallenged. When the official paperwork was signed and transmitted, marking the end of his military identity, I stepped outside into the crisp, late-afternoon air, the sky streaked with a kind of pale gold that made the base look softer than usual, and I realized the chapter closing around us would ripple into every part of his life, long after uniform folded for the final time. The day he cleared out his office, I was not present, but word traveled quickly on a base, where stories move with the same speed as weather fronts. Someone said he packed in silence. Another said he snapped at a clerk over misplaced papers. Someone else said he stopped midway through loading a box and just stared at the wall for a long minute. And though the details varied, the tone of the retellings remained the same. He looked like a man suddenly aware that no one feared him anymore, and without fear, his authority dissolved. When he walked across the parade ground for the last time, there was no formation to greet him, no salute line, no farewell gathering, just a man walking in civilian clothes through a place that no longer belonged to him, and the absence of ceremony carried a weight far heavier than any public reprimand. It was the clearest signal that the institution he once used as a shield had moved on without him. Later that evening, my mother left a message saying he had driven away from the base slower than usual, that he had sat in the car for several minutes before starting the engine. And though I did not respond, the image she painted lingered in my mind. A man confronting a future shaped not by honor, but by accountability. The final image that stayed with me came from someone in the locker room who said that before leaving, he went into the restroom, removed his uniform top for the last time, and looked at himself in the mirror for several long seconds. His reflection no longer framed by the insignia he believed defined him. And in that moment, he was not Colonel Ellison, not Sir, not authority, just a man faced with the version of himself he had spent years refusing to see. And though part of me once imagined I would feel triumphant witnessing his downfall, what I felt instead was something steadier and quieter, the assurance that justice had been served in a way that protected others without corrupting me, the sense that the closing of this chapter was not a victory chant, but a deep exhale, a clearing of the air after a storm too long ignored. A full year passed before I realized how much lighter my lungs felt, as if the air itself had thinned after the storm, and when I walked into the small briefing room at Joint Base Lewis McChord in the spring of 2025, the quiet hum of the projector and the soft shuffle of chairs reminded me that healing never arrives in a single dramatic moment, but in the quiet spaces where people finally speak what they once buried. The session was meant to be a closed conversation about domestic abuse in military families, a topic often whispered about in parking lots or exchanged in fragmented confessions between deployments. And as I looked at the faces gathered young soldiers with fresh creases in their uniforms, wives who had learned to measure their days in silence, a few older NCOs who had carried too many stories inside their chests, I felt something steady settle in me. Something that told me this was the first room where my story might serve as more than a memory. I introduced myself, simply not with rank or decorations, just my name, and I told them I would share a version of what happened, the version cleared by JAG, the version stripped of identifying details, because the point was not who he had been. The point was what patterns looked like when left to grow unchecked. I said that sometimes the person everyone salutes is the same person you are most afraid of at home, and the room shifted slightly, people leaning in just a little, as if granting themselves permission to exhale for the first time in a long while. I talked about how fear can be quiet, how anger can become normal when it enters through the door as routinely as evening light, how children learn to count footsteps and spouses learn to predict storms, and I watched recognition move across faces with a kind of aching familiarity, not dramatized, not loud, just the subtle tightening of a jaw or the blink of someone holding back tears, because the truth had landed close to home. When I finished, the room held that particular silence that exists when people are choosing whether to speak, and then a woman in her 50s, with hands folded tightly in her lap, raised her voice with a tremor that made the entire group go still, saying she'd always believed that if she ever spoke up against her husband, the Army would side with him automatically, that they would tell her he was important, that she should be patient, that she should support him through stress and deployments, and she said that listening to me made her feel something she had not felt in years, the sense that she might not be dismissed so easily after all. Her voice cracked halfway through the sentence, not from weakness, but from the effort of lifting a truth that had been heavy for far too long. And in her eyes, I saw a reflection of my mother, of the silent weight she had carried, of the moments when she had almost reached for a door she did not know how to open, and I felt a small, sharp ache that blended equal parts sorrow and hope. I told the woman gently that the system was not perfect, but people inside it were learning that there were officers who listened, that silence only protected the person causing harm, not the one enduring it. And as I spoke, I felt the layers of my own past settle into something that no longer hurt, to touch a memory transformed into a tool instead of a wound. After the session ended, I stood near the window while the group slowly dispersed, papers, rustling chairs, sliding softly the hallway, filling with muted conversation. And outside, a transport truck rumbled past carrying a group of young soldiers in fresh fatigues, their faces tired but hopeful the way only new service members can look, and the sight of them made my chest warm with a sense of purpose that reached deeper than duty. I thought to myself, I did not destroy his career. He did. I just stopped cleaning up after him, and the sentence felt truer now than it ever had. Not bitter, not triumphant, just clean, like the final page of a chapter, written with clarity, instead of fear. As I stood there, my phone buzzed with an email notification, and when I opened it, I saw General Carter's name at the top, offering me a new assignment or a promotion route depending on which direction I wanted to grow, and the message carried no hint of hesitation, no shadow from the past year, just confidence in my work, my judgment, my resilience. A quiet affirmation that what I had endured had not tainted my career, but sharpened it. I closed the email and let the moment settle in my chest, understanding that peace is never the absence of conflict, but the presence of a life finally lived without someone else's shadow pressed across it. And as the afternoon sun streamed across the floor, I felt the last remnants of the old fear dissolve into something softer, something earned. Before I left the room, I paused, knowing that the people who would hear this story next might need an invitation to speak the way I once had. So I offered the only closing line that felt right, saying, if you have ever been told to keep the peace while someone was breaking you behind closed doors, you are not alone. Tell me if you have seen a Colonel Ellison in your own life. Share what you can. I read every word.